Hello, this is Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time surfer of the Enochian Aethers, and welcome back to the Doctor on the YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss everything related to mysticism, magic, esotericism, the occult, and everything on the fringe of esoterica. And in this video, we're going to be talking about a subject that I've touched on here and there. I remember I talked quite a bit about this when I very first started my channel, which feels like eternities ago. Oh my god, so much has changed, it's crazy. But it's something I've not devoted a full channel video to, and it's one that I think is worthy of discussion, and that would be the role of plants in esotericism, ritual, magic, mysticism, etc. Because the role of plants can actually not be understated, even though it's something that we kind of just forget about. Especially on my channel, we talk a lot about metaphysics, and I think a lot of other people talk about the practicalities of it, like how do you execute a ritual, how do you prepare your space, how do you chant, that type of stuff. That we don't think about what things aid us, what tools we use, and how those actually do affect us metaphysically. Plants, when we use them in a ritualistic space, are not just things that are there. They serve a purpose. When you are performing a ritual or an act of mysticism, every single thing in your space is going to impact what comes of that experience. Because all rituals and mysticism operate based on a few laws, one of them being correspondence. So you need to be incredibly mindful of anything that you bring into a metaphysical space. And we bring in plants for some really interesting reasons. So let's get into it. So we use plants in a number of ways in a metaphysical space. It can be through consumption, say drinking a tea, through burning them in incense, through using them as a correspondence in whatever you're doing proper, especially if you're doing some sort of practice where you're physically putting things together and assembling things as part of your ritual instead of just, say, chanting. Most of what I do is that, but the ways that I use plants is through oils, incenses, and I do sometimes ingest plants and herbs as part of my practice. So all that stuff uses plants. And the reason why plants are so powerful, it kind of two reasons, and there are sort of two metaphysical philosophies as to why using plants in ritual makes sense. So the first one is the more simple one, which is the law of correspondence. Basically, this argues that all of ritual works based on this principle called as above, so below, or the macrocosm and the microcosm. We've explained this numerous times, so I'm gonna be quick with it. But for those who don't know, basically what we do in a small space impacts the large space because everything is interrelated and interconnected. That's why, say, when planets move, they affect our lives and vice versa, according to most theories. Now, the other theory for why it works is a little more complicated and gives a little bit more metaphysical agency to the plants themselves. And this is actually sort of an extrapolation from animism. Animism was the first religious idea that existed, and it was essentially that there is a spirit, essence, or life force in everything that is around us. I prefer the term divine spark, but essentially everything has a metaphysical character to it, and everything has a spirit. This obviously extends to humans, and this was the first idea of a soul that emerged, with the idea of a soul or spirit or metaphysical body of light being one of the most consistent ideas within religion, but animism often takes that further and applies it to things like animals. This is why you get in a lot of early religions sacred animals, though this does continue into later religions as well. And this sometimes even carries on into things that are not animals, into plants, and into various metaphysical structures. With plants, this argues that every plant kind of has a spirit to it, a spiritual character. Why this is true, or why everything is animistic or has a spirit to it, it's actually going to vary pretty broadly based on your metaphysical paradigm. There's a number of arguments for this. You can go with an emanationist argument, which is basically that everything begins with a point in a circle and emanates outwards. So everything is a sort of reflection of a higher divine and thus has a bit of divine in it. Or you could argue that since the divine reflects downwards, this is kind of similar to Al-Kindi's on the metaphysical rays theory that he gave to astrology. He argued that astrology worked because essentially Allah affected the planets and created the planets, thus they are a sort of reflection of Allah, and work because Allah created it. An argument like that could also work for this concept, but essentially, largely humans have believed that certain plants have a spiritual character to them. Whether how literal or how metaphorical that was, that's where you're gonna see some deviations, but fundamentally, the plant has a spirit to it, and thus, when you use the plant in ritual, you are bringing the spirit into the space. A lot of the times this does not involve invoking the plant, right? There are traditions that do that. Some shamanic traditions do it, and some modern witchcraft traditions do that. The most common example, and the one that I believe I've discussed before, comes from the Sabbatic witchcraft tradition, which is a descendant of Chumbley's idea, thus a descendant of chaos magic, and the broader Western esoteric tradition has this idea called phytonosis. This was created by Schulke, not Chumbley, who was kind of one of Chumbley's students and successors, and Schulke believed that every plant has a spirit to it, and thus when you interface with the plant, you are sort of taking in the spirit. He called this phytonosis, and he would argue that anytime you ingested a plant, you are in a sense possessed by that plant. Often very literally, right? If you are to take a cup of coffee and drink it, that is going to affect your brain and enter your blood, thus possessing you on a very literal level. As well, when you smell something, because perfume and incense is often given a very important place in religion, it does as well affect your sensory bodies and basically control your brain for a few seconds. And so that is why certain incenses are used in some traditions. I think we associate certain incenses with certain things. I think the most famous, though this isn't plant-based, it's resin-based, but it's very similar, would be frankincense. If you've ever stepped in a church in the West, you will smell that frankincense, especially if it's a Catholic or Orthodox church, right? It's like overpowering, and it puts you in this mindset and helps prepare your body, prepare your mind, and cleanse you for the mass or whatever it is you're attending that you're about to see. And you associate that, and that scent does something. I think everyone knows that one New Ager who likes burning herbs in a bundle and walking around their house. That actually has ancient roots. As interesting as it is, taking scents or plants or incenses and waving them around a space to cleanse or purify it or consecrate it for a certain intention is an incredibly ancient practice. And when you get into specific deities or gods or traditions, you're going to notice that very specific plants and smells are ascribed to them. Hecate has a number of really nasty smelling plants that are ascribed to her. If you look at the Greek magical papyri and if you attempt to do any of her traditional rituals, you're going to be burning some stuff that smells absolutely disgusting and kind of makes you want to throw yourself off a bridge. But why does it smell bad? Because she also rules over death. So of course it's going to smell with that death quality to it. That matches her metaphysical resonance and her correspondence. Now back to ingesting things. When you ingest something, it can do a number of things depending on exactly what it is. Certain things, if you ingest it, do nothing like psychoactive to you and essentially just are a correspondence, whereas others actually do affect you in a psychoactive way. Coffee and tea, we don't think of those as psychoactive substances. If you're like me, you drink black tea every single morning and you're caffeinated all the time. Maybe that's why I talk so fast. Maybe that's my secret. I know everyone is always curious about that. But it does have a psychoactive effect. It is fundamentally an intoxicant. For a while, I wanted to cut all intoxicants out of my life. And I remember when I got to coffee and tea, it sort of raised a question. Is this an intoxicant? And I kind of come to the conclusion as yes, but it's even not banned by some religions that call it an intoxicant. And we're going to talk about Sufism from Islam for a second. I promise this has a point. So the Sufis, to keep doing dhikr, which is a remembrance of Allah, which they essentially chant a name of Allah or something similar, certain surahs from the Quran, right? They do this for a very long time. This is a key part of a lot of Sufi practices. And often Sufi lodges and organizations will give Sufis coffee or tea so that they can keep doing the adoration of Allah deep into the night hours or deep into the early morning, as a lot of Islamic practice is done at hours that most people are sleeping in. If you've heard of Fajr, which is the dawn prayer, you know that that is when most people are asleep, and trying to wake up for that is like spiritual test in and of itself. I like my sleep. I understand why coffee and tea became such a central part of Sufi practice because of that reason. And then there are, of course, traditions that use them in a more overtly entheogenic, that's often the term that's used, way. This is where you get traditions that use basically herbs that cause a psychoactive, bordering onto psychedelic, often sometimes actually psychedelic reaction. I do not feel comfortable talking about those traditions, and a lot of those operate on these same metaphysical principles and assumptions, though there is a difference between that and just getting lit. I've been a little critical of psychedelic use not because I'm opposed to it on principle, but because I think that often people use it as a crutch and a way to get gnosis instead of learning to do the, hard work of mysticism. And if you know the hard work of mysticism, those experiences will actually do something more significant. And also I think it can cause a lack of grounding. I think that stuff is best practiced with a lot of restraint and should never be used as a crutch for someone's entire practice. So that's my stance on that. Not going to talk about it more, or Mr. YouTube might be a little bit mean to me. Now, the next thing I want to talk about in relation to these subjects is medicine and traditional medicine. So when we think of medicine now, we often think of going to a sterile urgent care or a hospital because you've broken your ankle or something like that. I'm sure we all have at some point gone to a doctor's office. Maybe you haven't, but I think most people have at some point. And modern medicine is very different than what traditional medicine used to be. Though there is still a metaphysical kind of underpinning to modern medicine to some extent, as they are still required to take the Hippocratic Oath, which does have roots in the Hellenic worldview and those Hellenic paradigms. But essentially, modern medicine is very scientific. But the scientific and the spiritual were not always as disconnected as they are now, which I think could be to the detriment of modern science. Because when you ignore half of reality, the spiritual, the metaphysical, you're never going to have a full picture of what is going on. So when you look to traditional medicine systems, I think specifically of Ayurveda and Chinese traditional medicine, though there are Western equivalencies as well, you will see that these medical systems are kind of metaphysically based, and a lot of them use herbs very, very heavily and dietary changes. Ayurveda obviously has a strong basis in the Vedic traditions. It is not just something to heal you. It is a metaphysical system. My earring went flying. This one is just deciding to run away. She's gotten gnosis, she's enlightened, she doesn't want to be on my head anymore. That's okay. So, Ayurveda. It is based in Vedic philosophies. I think there's a lot of things that are based in Vedic philosophies that we really like in the West, but we sometimes neglect their spiritual components, which I say is a disservice to it. Yoga, I've said similar things about. I think yoga is one of the most powerful spiritual systems. I mean, I've talked about how much I appreciate it. I mean, many of the great Western occultists who started Western occultism talked about it too, right? They'd written books about it, they discussed it. But what happens is people think yoga is just stretching. And so all they do as part of their yogic practice is essentially a workout. Of course, that workout still does have a metaphysical dimension to it because you can never detach yoga from where it began because of fundamentally what yoga is, right? Yoga is a metaphysical practice. There's no elimination of that, no matter how hard you try, no matter how many YMCA classes you go to, it is still that Vedic practice, but it is a diminishment and a neglecting of part of what it is, making it less powerful and honestly less interesting and less worth your time. So if you're going to get interested in Ayurveda, you should look at what paradigm that comes from. I think in general, we like to compartmentalize our spiritual practice, right? We're like, oh, this is my meditation time. And we neglect to think about how our entire lives are our metaphysical practice, right? It's not so separate. And I think this is one of the biggest mistakes that the postmodern mind makes, this compartmentalization, right? And it's natural, it's logical, right? We have our work time, we have our social time, and we want to keep it all separate. But life is not as separate as we think it is. These things, they go together. One of the big secrets of esotericism is the simple statement of there is no separation. Everything is connected. And that's something we should always remember. So traditional Chinese medicine is very interesting because traditional Chinese medicine operates upon a lot of Far Eastern metaphysical systems, specifically the elements amongst other things. And so if you go to see a TCM practitioner, they are going to assess you based on those systems and those ideas. Now, when it comes to Western traditional and herbal medicine, you see some similar things going on. And I find that incredibly interesting. Because when we remember what these plants do and we sort of seek out a relationship with these plants, our ability to heal ourselves becomes so much stronger, and it becomes an interaction of back and forth, right? A give and a take, which is what most spiritual relationships should be, right? I think we have a world where people just want to consume. They want to buy their way into enlightenment and not put in the work to develop a true relationship with whatever it is that they are interacting with. And that is one of the things that we should be doing when we interact with plants, when we take them in, when we smell them, right? Think about, what perfume do you wear to work, right? What perfume do you wear on a day-to-day basis? What plants are in that perfume and how are they impacting you? Because there's a number of ways they can. Obviously, each individual plant is going to have its correspondence, but often plants are ascribed to certain rulerships. I love astrology and I love astrotheology. Astrotheology is a branch of theology of sorts where you view religion towards its relationship to the cosmos. And what's interesting about that is there are actually astrological correspondences to most plants that we use commonly in metaphysics, as well as most resins and incenses and all that stuff. And so when you think about, what plants, what flowers are in my perfume that I wear, what do they correspond to? And you may notice that when you're wearing that perfume, you'll be affected by those correspondences, because once you're aware of these things, you tend to notice them more, and it all starts coming a little bit together, because awareness and contemplation are key parts of any metaphysical practice. Now, the final subject I wanted to talk about is practical alchemy. So alchemy now is kind of a spiritual practice. Most people who say they are alchemists are performing spiritual or metaphysical alchemy, which is using the principles of alchemy to transmute the soul, purifying it and transmutating it towards the ultimate goal of gnosis and theosis, or unification with the divine, or whatever you want to call it. There's a number of terms for this concept, but you get what I'm talking about, right? Now, before metaphysical and spiritual alchemy, though I guess before is the wrong term, there was practical alchemy, and practical alchemy was a deeply spiritual practice, and that was actually like making the things like the alchemist lab, and a lot of what alchemists did would form modern chemistry and modern medicine, though modern medicine often likes to forget that and writes off alchemy as this crazy thing that weird medieval schizos did. It was more than that. It was a deeply spiritual practice, and a lot of plants that were used in alchemy were given correspondences that were based in theology, and they were used very specifically. Now, I will caution you to not maybe just make your own alchemy lab and start doing crazy stuff, as that could be dangerous. We're not going full Taoist mode where you drink mercury to become immortal and then die. That's not good, not endorsing that. But some practical alchemy does still have a utility today. I don't feel like I have enough space to really explain that, but there is a really good book called Alchemy Rising, the Green Book from Scarlet Imprint, that does get into it. It has pictures, and I really, really like that book. I have actually helped someone with practical alchemy before. I've stood in a little alchemy lab approximation, and it is more spiritual than you would think. Just be careful and think about what has been written off as super dangerous and what is okay. And always, be careful. A lot of herbal practices, if you want to really understand the plants and go deeper with the plants, it would be recommended to make your own stuff. It's not obligatory. You don't have to make your own oils or your own incenses or your own teas. It's not necessary. A lot of people in history have not. But if you want to really connect to those plants and try to get that phytonosis and that relationship with the spirit of the plant and understand the correspondences on a deeper level, which once you understand a correspondence better, it will benefit you more in ritual, DIY can help. I notice when I DIY ritual things, I tend to have a stronger energetic connection to them. And when I'm in the space, I have it's just a better relationship with it. This is why a lot of people suggest when you get a set of runes or tarot cards to sleep with them under your pillow. Same kind of logic. You'll develop a connection that is just a little bit more powerful. I think it's impractical to try to DIY everything in your ritual space. If you have the time for that and the resources, that's amazing, and that is honestly the ideal and something we should aspire to, but realistically, that's not going to happen for most people, so do what you can. Learning this stuff is also just kind of enjoyable, and it teaches us what our ancestors used to do. Our ancestors used to make salves and oils and ointments, and it can be really good to do the things that the people of the past did to understand them more and humanize them more, because we often now think that all ancestors and people in the past were just completely different than us, and that's just simply not the truth. So this is all I have to say in this video. Please like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell, and if you subscribe for 93 days, you will meet your holy guardian angel, and you will never need to watch this video again. If you want to support me, I'm supported through my audience. You guys make it all possible. I have a Patreon. That's the main way I'm supported, where I post an extra video every single month, early access to all my videos, ritual guide, and I do private monthly consultations for the high tier people. It's all very exciting. And I also am on Instagram, Telegram. I'm now on Threads. I did join Instagram Threads. I'm testing it out. I don't know if I'll be on it permanently, but I am on it now. And I'm trying to post most days. So yeah, I'm there. Instagram, Substack, Telegram. I think I'm really everywhere. And I also have a Ko-Fi and a Venmo if you want to donate directly and not do the subscription model, which is completely legitimate. I also host the podcast, The Postmodern Iconoclast, which is a podcast that commentates on esotericism and culture. So it talks on more broad subjects. My videos tend to, and I go in greater detail. Sometimes I have guests, sometimes I'm solitary. Seems like people really like the solo episodes, so I'm definitely going to make more of those. So you can watch that here or on most podcasting platforms. I'm literally everywhere but Apple Podcast, so it's not hard to find. And I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, bye.